Good evening, everybody. I am Carol Allman-Morton, Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. And before we begin tonight, formally, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. Welcome, friends. This beautiful place where we gather today was once on the edge of the ocean as volcanoes and tectonic plates churned, surged, and ground into each other, raising mountains, then grinding them down on either side of what became the Connecticut River Valley. The waters receded, and then the wind, weather, and glaciers smoothed tall peaks and left behind beautiful and surprising erratic boulders that remain scattered in the woods and on mountains. Rivers cut valleys and distributed the runoff from hills and mountains, leaving soil and sediment rich for growing. We stand in a valley carved by the Housatonic River, which has supplied water and food for people and animals for thousands of years. We are surrounded by ancient forest and young woods filling in former farms and fields. They are home to eastern hemlock, maples, tall pines, and black birch, whose twigs have been used for toothbrushes because they break into bristles at the tip and have a minty taste. The meadows and fields of the Berkshires are home to Joe Pyeweed, beloved by bees, staghorn sumac, and yarrow, which provide food and medicine. The rain that fell today will be welcome in creeks and farms nearby. We acknowledge and honor the Mohican people, also known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Band. We acknowledge the injustice and hardships they have endured in being forced to relocate to Wisconsin, now living separated from their ancestral homeland, while still caring for this land. We are committed to act in partnership and with the support of Indigenous peoples of the Northeast as we learn about their history, celebrate their culture, and engage with their artists, writers, musicians, naturalists, and scholars. I'm going to turn things over to Barbara Grill shortly to introduce our artist tonight. But before I do, I want to name my gratitude to the artists from this show, Judy Dow, Cheryl Savageau, and Rhonda Besaw, and the volunteers who have made this exhibit and all the programs for We Are Still Here possible, especially Kate Kidd and Barbara Grill, who have spent a long week here preparing for this tonight, and I'm so grateful for them. Thank you for your time, your passion, and for your willingness to share your experience and gifts with the community. Thank you to the staff here at Shakespeare & Company, including Steve, Bob, Kevin, and Patrick. Thank you to Paul for videotaping tonight and sharing so that others may enjoy this later. And thank you to Julie Copenhaver for interviewing artists, lecturers, and others for a podcast about this program. I think I got everybody. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see this room full. It's really wonderful. And I'm delighted to be introducing Judy. Judy is one of three of the artists who are represented here at the exhibition. So Judy Dow is of French-Canadian and Abenaki descent and resides in Essex, Vermont, with her husband of 48 years. She is the mother of two, grandmother of three, with two granddaughters living right next door to her. She's been an educator for 38 years, teaching math, history, and science through her art. Judy has been a basket maker for 58 years, using over 278 natural materials. Her goal is to help people learn to read the land and understand the untold stories through her artwork. Using various mediums such as felted wool, wood, and gourds, she maps out and shapes stories to help people develop a relationship with the land. Judy received her BA in Native Studies, a BA in Education, and an MA in Teaching for Social Justice. She's been studying eugenics since 1972, researching and ultimately discovering that her family was the largest family targeted in the Vermont's eugenics survey. 623 members of her family were subjected to horrors such as being hunted down, tracked down, institutionalized, and sterilized. Judy is currently participating in an anti-eugenics exhibit, which is on a 2-year world tour, sponsored by an international program known as From Small Beginnings. In 2004, she received the Governor's Heritage Award for Education, and in 2021, received the Solidarity Book Award from Amherst College. Judy recently received the Arthur Williams Award for Meritorious Service to the Arts for her influential guardianship of Abenaki history and culture and her selfless service and devotion to teaching artistry. Currently, Judy is the executive director of Awikhigan, a position that she has held for over the past 5 years. Awikhigan is a multi-general endeavor to strengthen and revitalize the cultural knowledge and the identity of Native American women and their families from across New England. They work to conserve their traditional homelands and places of historical, ecological, and spiritual significance, and to educate others as to their importance. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce our wonderful artist, Judy Dow.
Thank you, Barbara. Barbara is such a great host. It's so nice to be here and so nice to see you all. I have a lot to say. I kind of made out an outline, but what I want to do is try to hit everything in the outline and do a little show and tell with what's around here. Is that all right with everybody? Sure. Yeah? Good? Okay, so I was raised in Burlington, Vermont 5 months of the year, and 7 months of the year we went to a dirt dead-end road in South Hero, an island in the middle of Lake Champlain. And there I lived with all my aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins, and I had a lot of them. My mother came from a family of 16, my father from a family of 12. And so in Canada, in 1890, there was a law that they wanted to increase their population, so they said, for everybody that has 12 kids, we'll give you 100 acres of land. For everybody who has 24, 200, and everybody who has 36 kids, we'll give you 300 acres of land. Sometimes they took several wives, but they got the land. And by 1894, they'd given away half a million acres of land. So they amended the law to be $100 for every 12 kids. And that was called La Loi de 12 enfants, the law of 12 children. And when they got that money, they were like, yeah, we can't live on this. We got 12 kids, we got 16 kids. So they started following the mills. They started going down to the mill towns in Colchester and Winooski and Burlington, Manchester, Lawrence, Lowell, down to Providence. And they would go down to these places and raise their 12, 16 kids, whatever it is they had. And they learned to survive and adapt. And Henri Mercier, the Prime Minister of Quebec, he was bound and determined he was going to annex Quebec to New England. And so he kept going to all these places, and he kept telling people, preserve your language, preserve your culture and your history, and we will annex Quebec to New England. Well, of course, he died, so it never happened, right? But now you probably all live in communities where there's Francos, right? French Indian people that speak both French and sometimes Indian, right? So in 10th grade, I was required to read a book called We Americans, The Cleavage of an American City. and it was written by Ellen Anderson, who is the executive director of the Vermont Eugenics Survey. So I began to question this book and recognizing my family and my cousins in this book, even though they weren't named. So I asked the teacher questions, and she's like, "Oh, my dear, this is a textbook. You must believe the textbook." And I was like, "Yeah, right." I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. So I knew exactly that I had to start questioning. And so I would go to the elders, I would go to everybody, and everybody had a piece of the story, but nobody had a complete story. And in 1986, Kevin Dan, a professor at Plattsburgh, found at Waterbury State Hospital 44 boxes of eugenics records that were stored in the back of the laundry room. So he began to read them, he began to write about them and publish them. And I'm like, oh, that's the answer that I've been struggling to find. Like, what is this? And the Vermont Eugenics Survey was what everybody interviewed did not have. They did not have that name. They did not know that this was an organized program, and that Vermont was one of 31 states that had organized eugenics program. So for those of you who don't know what eugenics is, it was a program that identified defective, dependent, and delinquent people, but it was all subjective. So by the 60s, it was deemed to be a pseudoscience. The problem is we still have it today. It just goes by different names, right? And so by 1999, Nancy Gallagher wrote a book. It was her thesis paper for her master's. And she was a biology teacher, and she took her master's in history. So she combined what she knew for biology with what she was reading about eugenics, and she wrote a book called Breeding Better Vermonters. So I'm giving a lecture at one of the local colleges, and this little lady in the back of the room kept raising her hand, and I kept thinking, who is this lady? How does she know about my family like this, So I talked to her afterwards, and Nancy had been writing. She was the author of the book. She had been working on this book, and she'd run across many things, and she started asking me questions. And so Nancy and I became very good friends, and we created a model to work together because Nancy was a descendant from Daniel Boone. And so we did not have the same viewpoints on many things. And so we created this model where we agreed on what research was on each perspective and how we could meet in the middle to find balance. And so Nancy and I worked together for, maybe 25, 30 years. And so we moved on to different directions in the studies. And I also serve in Vermont on this Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and of the Vermont Climate Council, the Life Cycle Analysis Committee, and the Biomass Task Force. And I do all of this because I retired once, but then I ended up somehow being the executive director of Gedakina. But through Gedakina, I feel like my actions and my words have to reflect care for future generations. So a lot of work that I do is to work with children and their teachers around the climate crisis, around traditional ecological knowledge, and another perspective of history. So that's what we have here today. So let's start with this over here. This is how I teach science. So this is a complete ecosystem. The Three Sisters Garden, right? We have the squash, the beans, and the corn. So you make a little mound, you plant the corn grows a couple weeks, you plant the beans, and the beans wrap around the stalk of the corn. And they support each other. The corn becomes the support for the beans, and the beans are legumes, and they're nitrogen fixers, and they put nitrogen into the soil for the other plants. And then around that, you plant the squash. And the squash have these big, big, picky leaves, right? So the squash grows. The raccoons don't like the touch of the picky leaves, so they can't climb up and get the corn because they can't go past the leaves. But also the leaves provide shade for the ground, so it helps it from drying up. And so we have these little mounds all over the place. And Gidakana has, in Vermont, we have 3 gardens that grow heirloom seeds. And all over New England, we have massive gardens that grow these seeds for production of food for our people. And we have just started using the 4th sister, which is sunflowers. And so we strategically plant the sunflowers where the prevailing wind comes. So these heavy storms we get because of climate crisis, they won't blow. The sunflowers protect the corn from blowing over because they're very heavy with the corn and the beans. And also the sunflowers draw the heavy metals out of the soil. So we work primarily with 4 sisters to make a complete ecosystem. So on the other hand, we have industrial agriculture. And what is industrial agriculture? It's genetically modified. So when they genetically modified a seed, it's a male only. So all these generations of people who have learned to save seeds and to have farmed by saving the seeds can no longer do that because the seeds are made male only. And so it's a very barren environment. And it's not a complete ecosystem. And I tried to indicate that here by putting the old crow here. So you're missing all the life from the other one. And so science and history and math is what I incorporate into most of my work. Many teachers teach auditorily, verbally. Some teachers teach visually. But there are a lot of kids who learn tactily. And so this gives them a chance to do hands-on to learn. And that's what I try to do. So my grandchildren live next door to me, and we spend a lot of time out in the woods. They have learned, they're 9 and 11 now, and they've learned to identify birds, 50 birds maybe, from their songs, and maybe 100 plants, and their use and their names. And so this is one of the first things we made as we traveled through the backyard. And we were learning to count. So we had 1 partridge, we had 2 old crows, we had 3 swallows, 4 wrens, 5 geese, and 6 turkey tracks. And so we began to put it together. And when I'm working with students, they might tell a complete story in just 1 square. In some classes, every student has made 1 square. We've put it together and made a whole class quilt. So I break it down into pieces so that every student has something to do. And for my grandchildren, for Juniper and Prudence, they've started entering art shows now with their little squares. So we do a lot with history as well. So in 1918, there was this little thing called the Migratory Bird Act of 1918. And what it did, it protected the claws, the beak, the feathers, the nests, and the eggs of the eagle, of the bald eagle. But when it did that, it created a problem because a lot of how it did it was to create national parks. And by creating those national parks, sounds like a great thing, right? But there was people living there. And those people had to leave once those national parks were created. And so it was good to save all of this, but it was problematic for those people who had lived thousands of years on those very lands that became national parks. So I do a lot of work around another perspective of history. And this is just a different perspective that you seldom read or hear of in a book. And we have our backyard is, I keep calling it our backyard for lack of a better word, but it's about 100 acres. And we have a meadow on either end with a forest. And so we have willow on the outsides of each end of the forest. And this is a path that gets you to the other meadow and all the plants you will see along the way. Lady slippers, trout lilies, snowdrops, there we go, fiddleheads and trilliums, so on. And what happens is, I intend to make every season, but I got spring done and life fell apart, right? And so again, this is a great thing to work with children with, to get them to read the land and understand the land is kin, the land is kinship. And for the land to survive, you have to develop a relationship. You have to know these things by name. They're your relatives, right? And that's unusual for them. Lots of times you'll hear kids tell the story of, well, I'm afraid to go out into the woods. My mother doesn't want me to go out in the woods. Bad things happen in the woods. So they develop these fears rather than these relationships. And when they grow up, they want to get rid of what they're fearful of, which is tough, right? And so I bring them out there, and they're like, we're going to get lost. This is my backyard. Do you get lost in your backyard? No. Okay, we're all set then. Let's go. And so we'll take classes, and we'll walk through the woods and develop a relationship with them. So here's another history class. There was a raid in a little place called Lancaster, Massachusetts. Did you ever hear that? It was not Massachusetts, it was Massachusetts Bay Colony. And King Philip raided, and Weetamoo, his sister-in-law, took the elders and the children and a couple of captives up the Ashalute and into the Connecticut River Valley. So here's the Connecticut River, here's the terraces. And what happened with most captives when they were redeemed, they got a book deal. And so they got to tell a story of being a captive. What was it like? Well, Mary Rawlinson's goes on and on and on about how hungry she was. I'm like, she's got to be kidding, right? And so I go there during the months that she's there. I stayed right there, rented an apartment, and started documenting the fish, the animals, the birds that were on all these terraces, and the food that was on these terraces. And I came to the realization she wasn't starving, she was picky eater. Especially because in Vernon, there was 3 caches filled with food and corn from the previous year. So she was quite the picky eater. But anyways, it's another perspective, right? And it's one you don't often read in the book. So right here we have a little lantern. Again, this is my meadow. Another way to tell the story, we identify the plants, we burn little holes in them, and it's like the fireflies in the meadow. Right here we have some baskets. I know there's do not touch signs all over, but I'm sorry. We have an old story of the creation of the Connecticut River Valley, which is like 14,000 years ago. There was this huge glacier here, and the glacier starts melting, and it causes all this disruption down here. And in our story talks about the Beaver Hill Till people, which is a Kumtuk, and how they have this battle with this 700-pound beaver who is building a dam for his family to come, and that in doing so, he's blocking the interval, the place where the animals and the place where the people get their food. And so they contact Hubbamuck and they ask them to help get the beaver to stop building. And the beaver's like, yeah, no way. I'm bringing my family down here. So imagine like 10 700-pound beavers living in a dam. It's a pretty big beaver lodge, right? And so Hubbamuck gets in this battle, and he breaks the giant beaver's neck, and everything releases. And so that giant beaver, how many of you heard this story before? You have. So this giant beaver today is Mount Sugarloaf, right outside of Deerfield, right? And here's his broken neck. And so when you look at that story and you follow it up the Connecticut River, you have Connecticut, you have Vermont and New Hampshire, right? And it backed it up all the way to Wabanaki, which is in southern Quebec. And Wabanaki is an Abeniki village, but it was 2 miles wide in some places. So you have the river here, you have the railroad tracks, and you have all the terraces that were formed as the Lake Hutchrock was formed and as the rivers backed up. And you can see that today. You can see 2 miles between New Hampshire's terraces and the terraces today. And these are just salt and pepper shakes. And so this guy from Amherst College, his name was Hitchcock, he writes this big paper about Lake Hitchcock, named after him, and how he discovered all this stuff. And yeah, we have this 14,000-year-old story that tells the same thing. So again, another perspective, right? So I'm going to meander on over here, and I just want to point this all out to you so you can take a minute and look at them afterwards, maybe, because I can't lift these. But stand up, come over here if you want, I don't care. So growing up with my father, and my grandfather lived with us, and I had all these stories about eugenics, but we didn't know it was eugenics. Remember I said they just didn't have a name for it? So my father would talk about this awesome backyard they had where they would chop firewood, and the outhouse was out there, and they washed their laundry, and there were no cars there where they lived, so they played poker in the middle of the road, betting on the license plates number, who had a better hand on which car came back. And so I wove all of his stories into this. And then I did research on Henry Perkins, who is was the executive director of the Vermont Eugenics Survey. And he had this backyard. He tells stories of a tree, just as my father told stories of a tree. He tells stories of a swing, just as my father told stories of a swing. But they're different, right? My father was living on a 30-foot cliff over the interval, and he'd swing out on a rope over the interval. And he'd swing on a nice little swing in his tree, and he'd read a book, he'd roller skate, ride his tricycle, and play croquet. And so there was distinct stories, and they were on the hill, and they were at the bottom of the hill. So there was distinct stories between the two communities. So I start reading the eugenics records, and I discover they're looking for children who have unsuitable backyards to play in. And that's where they were targeting. And again, it's subjective. I mean, this is an awesome utilitarian backyard to me, but not to him. And so it was not suitable to play poker in the middle of the road, or football in the middle of the road, or kick the can in the middle of the road, or any of these things, right? And so that's where some of these names began to happen. They began to appear. And so these two things were desperately opposite, right? And I'm still trying to understand this, and I'm interviewing people my parents' age, and I'm finding out these stories. I'm finding out that these people were doing whatever they had to do to adapt and survive. Brothels and moonshine and stills were a part of their life, and a big part of their life, because that's how they were surviving. And they were providing everything the people on the hill needed and wanted. They just didn't want a part of it because it was prohibition, right? So they'd go down and make a deal, down at the bottom of the hill and make a deal, but they wouldn't make the moonshine up on the hill. So there was distinct differences in how these communities operated and how they survived. So eugenics became a big part of my my research. I have gotten a fellow here at UMass Amherst and worked on eugenics projects that they had in their special collections. And so it was everywhere, right? And so I've been able to connect some state programs with state programs in our state. And they were all communicating. So if you get a chance to look at these, you'll see that story. I showed this at the Kupferberg Museum in Queens, and it was the first Jewish museum to acknowledge another Holocaust. And they asked 15 indigenous scholars to present, and this was the last one. And the board are Holocaust survivors. And when they got to this and they saw this, I didn't have to say anything. They didn't have to read anything. They said, this is the way it was for us. They recognized by seeing the backyards the difference right off. So again, a little science, a little history, and now math. So I don't know about here, but in Vermont, we have a huge population of new arrivals. And the new arrivals, by the time they get to middle school, if they don't have a grasp on the language that goes with math, they can't go on to algebra and geometry. They can't go on to all those higher maths, and then they can't go on to college. So there's this thing called 52 Bain concepts, B-O-E-H-M. And when your children were born, you taught them those 52 Bain concepts. You may not recognize the name, but you taught them things like on top of the table, under the table, put it next to, put it first, put it last. You taught them all those concepts that these kids have in their language, but they don't have in our language. And so consequently, they can't move on to math. So we use basketry to teach, I use basketry to teach them those 52 Bain concepts, which then in turn, they can apply to algebra or geometry. And it's something as simple as that that would hold these kids back. And I know that because my first language was French. And starting school, I thought I was in another world. I had lived in this secluded area my whole life with all my family who had spoke French. And so I understand that. I'm able to relate to them and teach them how to get around that, which helps a lot. So again, baskets I've been making baskets since I've been 10 years old. So now you get to figure out how old I am, right? And so like for instance, I go back to my backyard again. This is hand-pounded ash. And remember I said we have 2 meadows and a forest in the middle? So we have what on the top and the bottom? Birds, the birds in the middle. And in between we have the snails and the porcupine quills. So here's the story of our backyard. Again, this is another mathematical pattern. Try this one. And here's another one. So you'll get over 2 under 2, over 2 under 2 to make a distinct pattern. And these are very old ones that have come from the family. And I also like to work with gourds. And so I have lots of stories to do with gourds. So for instance, I have a place that I call my sit spot. So guess what I do there? I sit. And so I sit there and write, I sit there and read, I sit there and work. And all these little critters come up to my sit spot. And all these plants are part of my sit spot. So this is a working piece where I add everybody who comes to visit me at my sit spot. This is a creation story about the creation of Lake Champlain and the story of Otsioso. And so we have the lake, We have the Green Mountains, and we have the Adirondacks. And the whole story is on this gourd. And this is a story of blood quantum, which is what is the Native American ailment of today. The one-drop blood, you've heard of that maybe for African Americans. If you have one drop of African American, you're African American. But for Native people, it's a problem because of the agreements and treaties of we will give you a place to live, reservations, a special place too, right? I'm sorry, I'm being sarcastic. And we will give you food and an education. So it's costly for the US government to keep giving us this. So it keeps reducing. The lesser blood quantum you have, the more apt you are to not be identified as Indigenous. So blood quantum, fractals, all of that is a part of this one. And this one is a history one. So the little pine needles on here, I was in Florida, and they had a hurricane and knocked down this 350-year-old tree. I feel like I should be talking to you. This 350-year-old tree, it knocked it down in the hurricane, and it was 2 feet away from an auction where they sold enslaved people. And so I gathered a box of pine needles, and I've been making baskets, and that's what this is, just to represent that story of the witness tree that witnessed all those atrocities. I do a lot with recyclable stuff, and if you get a chance to go to the Stockbridge Library in the next couple months, please go, because they have a bunch of my stuff on exhibit, and it's like miniature of this stuff. So everything you see here, I teach to children, and so you'll get to see the child size of what they're teaching, what I'm teaching. So for instance, this is a cottage cheese container made into a nest, and these are the little eggs that you do Easter egg hunts on your front lawn with, and so I just wove around them. And then here's the climax, right? So this is a viper snake, and they're pretty cantankerous snakes. And so I have a Happy Meal toy here. It's one of the 7 dwarfs. And so my story is the new stranger in the park is McDonald's, enticing our children into a world of high blood pressure and diabetes. And the viper snake is going to get them. So this, do you remember I told you I used to live in Burlington? Well, this is supposed to represent Burlington, but I took an artistic license to make Burlington. It doesn't really look like this. And we would travel down the road to a dirt road that we lived on that was dead end. And so it's the whole story of my traveling back and forth from Burlington to South Hero, 7 months in South Hero, 5 months in Burlington, my whole life. And so I told this story. And these gourds are funny shaped. I manipulate them when they're growing to be odd shapes so I can make a story on them. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry we played this game of disruption where everybody had to move, but I figured you'd want like the 5-cent tour of everything here. Thank you. So, questions? Yes?
What is the blood quantum now?
Well, every tribe is different. They have their own government, so they do their own thing. And as their numbers get reduced, they usually have governmental meetings, and they reduce the blood quantum. So it changes all the time for each nation. Mhm.
The island that you talked about,
South Europe.
yes, but it's still an active island?
It is. The neighborhood that we lived on, the dirt dead end road, is all gentrified now with $1 million homes.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, it's not the same.
So when you were describing the backyards,
Mm-hmm.
when they found a backyard unsuitable, what would they do with the kids?
They institutionalized the kids. They went to the families. Often they did interviews, and they had this thing. You guys are at the age. You ever hear of LIS? No? Oh my God. Living in sin.
We heard of that.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so they had this thing. They actually, sorry. So they had this thing where if you cohabitated, so say Brian and Barbara, you weren't really married, they would, and you had children, they would incarcerate you and take the children. And in some cases you were married, they just couldn't find your marriage certificate, so they'd do the same thing. And for indigenous people, it's common practice that if you should pass, the brother would move in to help Barbara raise the children. And so they were cohabitating, and it was problematic. They were LIS, and so the kids would be taken. So they had these amazing laws, like if you were living in idleness. Now think of kids today who go home and they're, so if you were living in idleness, you could be institutionalized. If you lived in a house of ill repute, or a house where they had liquor because there was prohibition, right? And then you could be institutionalized. The parents would be locked up, and the children would be there were 17 institutions in Vermont for children. And my grandmother was scooped off the street and placed in Waterbury State Hospital. And my grandfather never knew where she was, so after 5 years, he divorced. And when I found the divorce decree, it said abandonment. And I read it to my father, who was 88, and he didn't know anything about it. And so then I looked at my grandmother's death certificate, and she had died when my father was 16, but she had disappeared when my father was 5. And so he lived part of those years in an orphanage because my grandfather couldn't work and take care of a 5-year-old. So he spent many years in an orphanage, many years running away from the orphanage too. But you can see this backstories of people, that trauma is like still with many generations today. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that the person who spoke before, are you Barbara? Yes. Barbara mentioned Abenaki.
Abeniki?
Is that different than
Abenaki?
Abenaki?
Ah, no, c'est la même chose, n'est-ce pas? No. So the original word for these people is Wabanaki.
Wabanaki.
Waban is white, Aki is land. So is the people from the White Land or the Dawnland, where the sun first rises.
That's the Dawnland.
Yes, okay. So the English say Abenaki. Along the Hudson River Valley into New York were large Dutch settlements, and they say Abenaki.
Abenaki.
The French had no sound for W. So Wabanaki became Abeniki. And so they're all right. You just tell someone's ancestral background by how they say it.
Yes.
And so if I say Abeniki, my ancestral background is what? French, right.
French.
Yeah?
Question.
I have one, in the coloring book, you were explaining to me that there's 5 languages, one for each season, and then I guess 2 of them. Could you just talk about the different languages?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things we discovered in Vermont is they've passed this law, Act 1, where they want people to teach Abenaki histories. Well, how can people teach Abenaki histories without resources? So we're trying to make resources. So this is a resource book or a coloring book that we've made. And so each season is a different Wabanaki language. And two of the languages are very similar, so we put them together. So the Penobscot is winter, and so you'll go through all these pictures and words of the Penobscot people. And then when you get to, there's bears and maple syrup, all of them connect to stories. Smelt, woodpeckers, hemlock. And then when you get to Siguan, you're talking Abeniki and you're talking spring. So then you have pages of Noka, the deer, page and Abeniki. You have the spring pictures. And then you go on and you get to Nippon is Passamaquoddy and Maliseet together, because their languages are very similar. So we tried to get as many languages as we could, because there's only 4 seasons, right? And then the last one, I think, is, let's see what the last one is. Mi'kmaq, or some people say Micmac, but it's Mi'kmaq. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to create resources for teachers to use, because being a teacher for 38 years, I'm like, you can't teach without a resource, right? Because it might not be right. So that's what we're working on. That's another good question. Thank you.
To that point, the languages then were somewhat different, and therefore communication between the different tribes would have been very difficult.
No, because it's similar but accents. So we didn't really have a written language. It was pictorial, right?
Yes.
And so if you read the Jesuits' work, they talk about telling a biblical story. Everybody will write the story with charcoal on birch bark, and they're all different pictures, but they can all retell the story from the pictures they drew. And so it's the same thing, but different. And that's with the languages. There's little slight accents, slight difference, because we never had a written language. They were written by Europeans. The language was, for the most part, created as a written language by Europeans.
What is happening education-wise for the children who are Indigenous, either in Canada or in the United States?
Yeah. So Gidakana has a program. We have a lot of programs, but one of our programs that is really popular is our One Shelf Book Project. And what we do is we read like 60, 70 books a year, the new books. And we create a list of 50 books. And we give those 50 books to 25 to 30 schools as a gift. And we read the newspapers all year, and we identify schools that are dealing with racial issues, schools that have mascots, and we give them this gift of 50 books. And the reason we do that is because the latest research show the greater their distance is from knowing Indigenous people, the more apt you are to have a mascot. And so we want them to know. And what the really positive part about that is our Indigenous children see themselves in a positive light on the bookshelves in the schools. So that's one very popular program that we have. And that's the one Barbara talked about, that we won the Solidarity Book Award from Amherst College last year because of that. And so we do projects like that all the time, where we educate not only reservation schools, but also, because in most reservation schools, the teachers are not native. So you have to teach the teachers. And so we do a lot of training on stereotypes and bias, and helping them understand what these things mean, because how can they do the right thing if they don't even know that they're doing something wrong? So we go all around. We get on reservation and off reservation schools, we do a lot of teaching.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
So the 2 houses here, is that a different time and place than the 100 acres that you spoke of?
Well, the 100 acres is my backyard. Uh,
Currently,
Currently.
yeah, yeah.
But this, so my family has lived for 9 generations in the same, pretty much in the same neighborhood. And that was in downtown Burlington. Well, up on the hill of Burlington. That was the 1920s and 30s during the eugenics period. And so eugenics in Vermont ran from 1925 to 1936. But it started in the 1890s with a lot of social welfare laws, the passing of social welfare laws. And so they might pass, so imagine a family with 16 kids. It's taken every kid to help feed this family and every kid to help raise them, right? And so they were passing laws that every kid had to go to school, which was breaking these families apart because there was nobody to care for the little ones. And so they started passing these social welfare laws in the 1890s that were severely problematic on these large French Indian families, French families. It was really problematic.
So when you, do you know what year it was when you obtained that 100 acres of land for having 12 kids or 26 kids or?
Oh yeah, that was 1890 to 1894. And in 1895, they amended the law to be $100.
Oh, so did they take that land?
No, that 100 acres I'm talking about,
Yep.
we bought.
Oh, okay. That wasn't given.
No, we worked hard to buy that. Yeah.
That answers that, yeah. I was just wondering because that backyard seems like a representation of a lot smaller backyard than.
It is.
So, yeah.
It is. Yeah, you're right. It is. Good. I'm sorry I wasn't clear on that.
No, it's all good.
But it's, yeah, so our backyard, what we call our backyard now, is shared, of course, with my children. And so they're living back there. They're gathering back there. They're learning the medicinal plants. They're learning traditional ecological knowledge, gathering for food, medicine, material, culture, and religion. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
Last question.
Okay.
Is there a good book on eugenics movement and Native people and?
In general?
Pardon?
In general, around the country, or?
Well, about what happened to your family.
Yeah, there's a great book. I wrote a chapter in this book called Global Indigenous Health. I think I sent the chapter to you, didn't I, Barbara?
Yes. Yeah, okay.
And so maybe you can get it from Barbara?
Yeah, yeah.
And Nancy Gallagher wrote this awesome book called Breeding Better Vermonters. And she tells the perspective from Daniel Boone, you know, that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant perspective. And she tells the whole story of all the laws and how the laws created and impacted what happened there. And until we started working together, nothing was written from the other perspective. So I've been frantically trying to tell that story. And I seem to be telling it more by art than I am by writing a document. But I did write a document as a chapter in Global Indigenous Health.
Okay, I'm Catherine Kidd. I'm just going to end this. Thank you so much, Judy.
Thank you.
That was fabulous.
Thank you.